Hi, my name is Reggie Ramos, Executive Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, and I'm your host on today's episode of GBH Amplifies. Very often we talk about transportation in terms of roads, bridges, trains, cars, and bikes. What we often do not hear about is how our transportation systems offer a unique view of the state of our democracy and social cohesion. We take for granted transportation, how we move around, because of its ubiquity, because of its constant presence in our lives. Today, we are pausing, hitting the brakes, so to speak, to talk about transportation in the context of how it can be a stage for change, how it is the cauldron for tolerance and humanity, and why it's vital to our democracy. Today, I am joined in conversation by Brendan Kearney, Executive Director of WalkMassachusetts, Tiffany Cogell, Executive Director of the Boston Cyclists Union, and Katarina Torres Radisic of the Boston Center for Independent Living and the Riders Transportation Access Group. All right, let's get at the heart of the matter. And Tiffany, let me start with you. We are living in such interesting times, sort of defined by a rejection of climate realities, indiscriminate ICE operations playing out on our streets, and what feels like a return to highway supremacy. The sweeping changes have been challenged in courts as an affront to our constitutional and civil rights. And I want to quote here Carolyn Crockett, where I think she really captures what I want to get at. And she says, although America's civil rights history is often told as a growing series of citizenship claims aimed at the 14th Amendment, many of its most defining battles have been waged in the context of transportation access. We've seen this play out in Plessy versus Ferguson, Rosa Parks and Montgomery bus boycott, and the anti-highway movement here in Boston from the 60s all the way to the 80s, and more recently in the George Floyd protests that we've seen in the last couple of years all over the country. Why do you think that is? Why is transportation the arena where many of these struggles are fought? And what makes transportation such a stage for democracy?
So when we think about transit or transportation, it's mobility. And mobility equals freedom and our liberation and our decisions and choice for how we choose to move around. If we think about all of the civil rights activities and activities where humans have protested or fought for any kind of right, it has always been coupled with movement, whether that was along the street or some kind of tangible progress moving forward. And so when we think about the state of transportation and transit in our current federal administration, we think about the position to stall, pause efforts and initiatives, resources to maintain and further access to safe streets, bridges, any kind of safety infrastructure. That is a front to our freedom and our liberation. So when we talk about things like safety infrastructure and bike lanes, it is a way for people to travel safely.
Yeah, and it really is sort of this transportation being emblematic of the values we hold. You talked a little bit about civil rights and how it played out in streets and sort of played out in history. And I want to talk to Kat about, I know that the disability community, which the sector that is that you work with, has really this interesting history of civil rights and how the disability community has helped shape sort of the way transportation and the way transportation as we know it is taking place. So can you share more about that and sort of how the disability community really sort of elevated civil rights as a centerpiece in the way we're doing transportation?
Yeah, absolutely, Reggie. That's a really great connection that you're making. I believe that transportation is a stage for democracy because accessible and equitable transportation systems are essential for individuals to fully participate in their communities and access critical resources like political and civic opportunities. And a powerful example of this, like you mentioned, can be seen in the local efforts of the Black Panthers Party during the anti-highway movement here in Boston. members like Bradley Lomax, who lived with multiple sclerosis and faced barriers with inaccessible public transportation in Oakland, California, recognized that intersection between racial and disability discrimination. And he played a key role in establishing a local chapter branch of their local Center of Independent Living in Oakland, California, which partnered very closely with the Black Panthers Party to address accessibility barriers in the community. And the Black Panthers also demonstrated cross-movement solidarity during the 504 sit-in of 1977 in San Francisco, where people with disabilities demanded enforcement of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination of any federally funded programs. The Panthers helped provide food and medical supplies to protesters during that 28-day sit-in, which really showed their commitment to mutual aid and justice. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that these examples show that many defining battles for civil rights, including, disability rights to racial justice, have been waged in the context of transportation access, because ultimately democracy depends on all of us showing up for each other.
Yeah, the story about the Black Panthers is really one of my favorite stories of, historic and iconic collaborations between groups, right? That has really produced and influence the way civil rights are being played out in our transportation systems. I really want to bring us back to the present. And in the last few years, we've seen bipartisan legislation explicitly naming the harms of our federal highway system and funding efforts to address these harms. However, very recently, we've also seen orders coming out of the U.S. Department of Transportation also explicitly rescinding programs that advance diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI, signaling a departure from environmental justice and the social costs of our transportation projects. Tiffany, in your view, from where you're sat, how does this impact us both at the level of the state and at the level of communities?
So historically, Black and brown neighborhoods, underemployed folks, immigrants, people that we consider or we term as marginalized, have always depended upon resources from either federal or local governments. And so we correlate that with understanding that there are a lack of resources. We correlate with understanding the historical context behind why the resources were needed in the first place. And when we think about DEI and where that is right now, the misinformation of what DEI actually is, we're faced with looking at discrimination actually based on who people are, where they live, and what they need. So looking from top down, we are very dependent upon resources from the government and from our city and local governments.
How are you seeing this too? You lead Boston Cyclists Union, and I'm sure you're seeing some sort of change in the way we approach safety infrastructure,
Okay, yes.
right? How does this policy reversal, what seems like a policy reversal on the federal level, sort of impact and trickle down at the community level?
So what it's going to boil down to is lack of freedom and lack of mobility in our streets. We champion bike lanes. Bike lanes allow cyclists to be able to get around freely and safely. But it also helps pedestrians, and it also keeps cars where they're supposed to be. So bike lanes are not just about bike lanes. It's about letting people know the safe ways to move around. So if we're looking at getting rid of the resources that help initiate or facilitate safety infrastructure, then we're talking about removing the ability to be able to move around safely, and that is an affront to our freedom and liberation.
Brendan, Tiffany talked about sort of this collective interest and seeing it from the lens of community. We know from experience that policy changes have real impacts on our built and physical environment, and a lot of these policies are decided with a top-down approach. How much of an influence and power do you think communities actually hold in shaping their own neighborhoods and how it can look like and how they can be responsive to their needs?
Yeah, thanks for that. So Walk Massachusetts, we're a statewide pedestrian advocacy organization. I have one or two slides. And when people think of walkable places, there is an image of people being able to, sit anywhere, people talking, green spaces, shaded, a great community gathering space, people of all ages. But that's not the reality that a lot of communities have across Massachusetts. The next slide has, the actual reality where it's, there isn't, it's really car infrastructure. This is a woman named Rebecca walking down the street in Springfield with her walker that she named Myrtle. And behind her is a senior center. In front of her is the independent living. It's not actually independent living because most people have to take the shuttle to get to the senior center. And streets where vehicles just drive much higher than the speed limit. It's a real issue and limiting for people out on the street. I think that the policy piece, we set the speed limits by, there's a policy on how you set speed limits, or whether or not speed humps or raised crosswalks can even be available for planners or engineers to add. I've heard before, we can't add speed humps or raised crosswalks to this project because then everyone would want them in their neighborhood. And my response is, and why is this a problem? I think we need to get out of that scarcity mindset. And, also, the last piece is we hope and believe that some of that calculus can change through using walk audits. We think of walk audits as community engagement tools to get people out on the street and experiencing those problems.
I was just gonna ask you, how do you actualize this community power? And you talk about this walk audit, and how do people get behind this, and what's needed, and what needs to happen before walk audits actually happen?
Yeah, I think part of that is getting back to having shared experiences, because for the last couple of years, and especially now, we are just flooded with AI slop videos out there of what a non-shared reality. So getting people to experience the streets and sidewalks together and hear from their neighbors about the challenges of crossing a 45-mile-per-hour roadway when they're in a wheelchair and they're just trying to get to the senior center. I think it's important for the people that make those policies and the people that can impact those policies to really hear from the people that are most desperately needing these changes.
Yeah, I love this idea of a shared experience. That's what streets are for. It's only when you have shared experience that you can share values, that you can share truth, right? Which is really hard to come by these days. Kat, I want to pivot and sort of talk about your sector, the disability community that is often overlooked in transportation planning. We've just talked a little bit of DEI, and we know that people with disabilities have played a crucial role in putting DEI into law. Can you talk more about sort of the barriers that people with disabilities experience here in Massachusetts insofar as transportation access is concerned, how that impinges their quality of life, and what are the potential impacts of these policy reversals that we're seeing trickle down from the federal government to the states?
Sure, yep, great question. Like you said, the disability community is often excluded from transportation planning, despite its critical role in shaping DEI policies and civil rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the ADA. And while the MBTA here in Boston has made significant strides in improving transportation accessibility, largely due to the historic class action lawsuit Joanne Daniels Feingold et al., the MBTA, people with disabilities across the state, particularly those living outside the MBTA service area, continue to face persistent and systemic transportation barriers that limit their ability to participate fully in public life. And in Massachusetts, some key accessibility barriers in transportation include inaccessible infrastructure such as subway platforms and elevator gaps, as well as a lack of curb cuts and poorly maintained sidewalks, which make independent travel difficult for everyone, especially people with disabilities. In addition, poor winter snow removal of sidewalks and bus stops can completely cut off access for people with disabilities, especially those who use wheeled mobility devices. Outside of the MBTA service area, service is fragmented. In rural regions, long distances and few public transit options leave many disabled individuals without reliable access to essential services, jobs, and other social opportunities. I think it's important to acknowledge that approximately 1 in 4 people in the US are people with disabilities, and that's the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. It's the only minority group that doesn't discriminate. And, however, under the Trump administration, foundational civil rights laws such as Title VI and the ADA have been reframed as woke policies, DEI policies, which has really undermined critical protections and slowed enforcement. And these policy shifts have real consequences. Without federal funding or pressure, localities struggle to make necessary accessibility upgrades. And I think, the main message is that transportation is a civil right, and it's essential to ensure that people with disabilities and older adults are included in transportation planning from the outset, and that their rights are upheld and enforced at all levels of government.
I think it's really important to name that transportation is a civil right. And mostly, when we talk about transportation, it's mostly about numbers. So here we go again with the budget, and transportation is a huge part of it. But when we really look at how transportation has impacted American life, American society, we get an exclusive view of what's really at stake, right? And I want to talk about something really timely, and we're seeing it in the papers right now. And we've talked about access and safety, and it doesn't really look like the same for everybody. We see this reality being manipulated in ways that divide us, and not in ways that inspire solutions that sort of account for everybody. So in politics, we often see roads, highways, bridges, bike, pedestrian lanes. These are all seen as proxies for political ideologies and leanings. We are seeing this play out in local politics. So transportation, for me, as political proxies, really is super dangerous. Because while it panders to a political base, it also undermines really helpful projects that keep people safe, get them where they need to go in the way that they choose to. Brendan, I want to ask you this question because I know you're steep into the work, and as an advocate, how do you think this political proxy coded language should be addressed, and what can help people see beyond this rhetoric?
Yeah, so WalkMass had Worcester City Councilor Etel Hajiai as our keynote speaker back in April. And she said, I never really anticipated road safety policies would become such a contentious and difficult issue to tackle as they have been in Worcester. The reason Etel started speaking up and started getting involved in transportation safety in Worcester was because one of her constituents, a young girl named Candace, was hit and killed on a wide, fast roadway. That is why she got involved. She started organizing her neighbors. She started organizing residents in her district to do safety walks and walk audits. That's not politics. That's moral leadership. That's something that I hope we can all aspire to, and have more elected officials and people doing the work to make streets safer can follow, so we don't lose another Candace in Worcester, that we don't lose another Gracie in the Seaport, that we don't lose another Sydney in Andover. Like, these are 3 girls in Massachusetts communities that should still be here, still be with their families.
Right. Now it's time for some question and answer from the audience. Although I see Councilor Enrique Pepin in the audience, and would like to ask him without putting him on the spot, and I promise I asked nicely beforehand, to share some of his insights on both being a resident and a policy maker, right? Lately, we've seen quite a few road incidents, road crashes, and even fatalities. And I'm wondering, for you, Councilor Pepin, and as a resident and a policy maker, how does road safety actually take shape in neighborhoods, and how does safety, as it shows up in different neighborhoods, speak to equality or inequality?
Absolutely. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Councilor Enrique Pepin, representing District 5 in the City Council here in Boston. And this topic that we're talking about here today is probably the number one issue that I hear about in my office. I represent the southern part of Boston, so that's Rosnell, Hyde Park, and Mattapan. And unfortunately, we have had some tragedies, some fatalities, especially in the Hyde Park neighborhood, where about 2 years ago we lost a 4-year-old, and about a few weeks ago we lost a 5-year-old. And when I think about this and I think about what solutions we have, I realize that as policymakers, we're too reactive with transportation infrastructure improvements. We look at situation as a one-off instead of looking at it as a holistic approach, which is why one of the first hearing orders that I introduced on the City Council was to implement a safe school zone program for the entire city of Boston. We do have one person who is amazing. Her name is Silvia Castaños. She works for the Safe Routes to School Department at the Boston Transportation Department, but she's only one person. So we have to make sure that, one, we are funding those departments. Two, we are coming up with a holistic plan to look at not just one street in my neighborhood, but the entire city at every single school zone. I talk all about schools because I have a lot of elementary and middle schools in my area. And how is it that we can improve the infrastructure there so that parents, students, staff members all feel safe, because they're not being dropped off in cars. They're walking to school. They're taking bikes to school. And they're being dropped off in school buses and by their parents. So we have to look at this approach from all angles.
Reggie, I'd like to just pile on what
Sure.
the council was saying.
Sure.
One thing that New York City did a number of years ago to improve safety around the schools is they added safety cameras to, ticket the people that are driving unsafe around schools in school zones. And that drove down the numbers of violations. Over 70% of people that received one violation did not receive another violation. So it's actually changing behavior. We have a bill at the State House right now for safety cameras. There was just a hearing in front of the Joint Transportation Committee last week, but it's a municipal opt-in, so cities or towns across the state could opt into a camera program, and they could decide to do it in school zones. I think that would be a great way to start.
Right. Tiffany, we talked about this previously, and I'm really kind of piqued about when we had this conversation about having this talk. You were talking about dual worlds, dual reality, right? And the power of lived experience in sort of shaping how we see transportation and transportation projects, programs as a whole. I wanted you to can you speak more to that? And of course, we negotiate through streets. As a woman of color myself, we negotiate streets in our bodies, and it is. I think we need to name that too also produces different experiences for all of us in a unique sense. But streets also offer this sort of really unique avenue for us to have that fleeting encounters where it holds all of our differences in a very beautiful way. So if you could speak to that and share your thoughts with the audience, that would be great.
So when we think about shared spaces, streets and byways and public places, those are shared spaces. And we don't get to choose who we're sharing those spaces with. And in many cases, it's an education for us, even though we take that subconsciously, for how to be equitable and accepting and to actually share, which is something that we humans sometimes have a problem doing. It's a lesson in compromise. And so it's not just on the sidewalk. When you're approaching your fellow human being, you learn how to take up less space, almost, it's subconscious. You make room. When we're talking about sharing space on the road, also, again, we're called to compromise. And so how do trucks, how do bikes, how do cars take up space? How do pedestrians also utilize that space in the same way? And depending upon who you are and how you choose to travel down the street determines whether you are at the top of the food chain or if you are most vulnerable. And so when we're thinking as active transportation advocates and activists and lawmakers, council people, legislation makers, we have to accommodate for our most vulnerable.
I think that's a really important perspective that we need to hear over and over again. But I see we have one question from the audience, or a couple of questions. Yes, ma'am.
Zakia Alake, South Boston, but most of my life I've lived in Roxbury. And most of my adult life I've been an organizer or an activist, going to community, civic association and neighborhood association meetings where no one over the age of 40 has ever said to me they think that bike lanes are a good idea in our neighborhoods. And so I think, and I've only been here for, since 1:05, so I may have missed it. What kind of mitigation efforts, what kind of extra, maybe extraordinary efforts can we make in Black and brown communities that are suffering already from overdependence on vehicles? Thank you.
Excellent question. I look to Brendan and Tiffany to answer this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last piece that she mentioned is important. Just last year, 66% of the pedestrian fatalities took place in environmental justice census block groups. Like, these are places with big, wide roadways that think about cars first. That's part of the historic and present day injustices in transportation planning that have, that we're still dealing with the repercussions of the 40s and 50s.
Tiffany, I saw your eyes glimmer. Thoughts?
So when we talk about this paradigm of car centrism versus bike lanes, we forget that these modalities are used to house, to carry, or to hold people. I would really encourage people to stop saying the cars or classifying roadways as just the bike lanes without remembering that these things are to either bring some people somewhere or to protect people who choose to a specific mode of transportation. When you talk about Black and brown communities, particularly in Boston, we're talking about Mattapan, Hyde Park, some parts of Dorchester, and absolutely Roxbury and Dorchester. Yes, Grove Hall, absolutely, Nubian Square. We're talking about communities who have been underserved, left out, communities that have not had the opportunity to participate in a real way in deciding how their streets feel and how they move around. So car centrism in a large aspect is very cultural. And so how do we change that? That's going to take education, respect, time, being humble, and patience, right? And so together with community organizers and legislators, we have to figure out how to work together, first of all, to bring the education and the space. So activists and advocates and engineers, we have, I guess, what you would call technical experience. But folks that live in the neighborhood, they have lived experience that no engineer would ever be able to to manufacture. And so one without the other is incomplete, and that's a recipe for an incomplete solution in an incomplete street. So when we talk about infrastructure changing in communities of color, we have to remember that we need their voice. And so we've got to start there. And sometimes that means slowing down the process and being sensitive to cultural norms.
Excellent. That's about all the time we have. There's really a lot more to unpack. But what is clear, though, is that when we employ the lens of safety, equality, democracy, humanity, it transforms the way we look at transportation. If you want to be engaged in conversations like this one that we just had, please hit us up at t4ma.org. That's T, the number 4, ma.org, and follow us on our socials. I want to thank Kat, Tiffany, and Brendan for joining me today, Councilor Pepin, our live audience, and the GBH Amplifies crew, Liz Cheng, Sandra Lopez Burke, Paul Singer, Annie Schraffler, Juan Jose Cadena, Frederic Rigolo. Thank you, everyone. Gracias a todos. Daghang salamat. Wishing you all safe travels.